Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, and our special guest, delighted to welcome back EPC Senior Policy Analyst Amanda Paul. Today, we're going to be discussing the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. And we're going to particularly then be focusing on the energy and cost of living crises and looming recession and what the EU needs to do, but lots of other issues we're going to try to wrap into all of that. As always, totally interactive, some questions from me to our panel and later, I hope, from all of you. Your microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question when I open up to the floor, please click on the handshake button and I will unmute you when the time comes. Or as always, you can write your question. Please use the Q&A box and please be as brief as possible. Okay, let us start with developments in Ukraine. And Amanda, great to have you with us. Always fascinating to get your insights on what is happening and what it means. First of all, just in terms of the Russian strategy at the moment and these ongoing strikes on critical infrastructure. We're seeing energy, more on the nuclear plant overnight, water, civilian infrastructure. What do you think is the Russian aim here, and what should the West be doing about it, both in terms of the consequences and also this moving into the very difficult period of the year? How can they help Ukraine through this period?
Well, thank you very much, Jacki. I mean, the situation in Ukraine today is extremely serious. We're seeing a major humanitarian catastrophe unfolding. And to come to your question, I think the fact that Russia is losing on the battlefield since early October, it's switched tactics. And this is when we started to see this new indiscriminate missile and drone strikes on Ukraine's critical and civilian infrastructure. This has been prioritized, in fact. I mean, it's basically a war crime. And at least 40% of Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure has now been damaged. I would say the goal of this is to bring Ukraine to its knees, more or less by freezing and starving the population to death. This won't work. In fact, it will make Ukrainians more defiant than ever. I mean, as they say, they will continue till the last Ukrainian is standing. And I think we can take that as a fact. I think that the Russians have mainly focused, I mean, they focus countrywide, but a strong focus has been placed on the big cities, particularly Kiev, but also large cities like Kharkiv, because they're linked to the really major energy networks and grids. Some of the smaller towns and other habitation areas aren't. So to some degree, they haven't been so badly affected. But unfortunately, we're seeing a situation now where the periods of blackouts and no electricity and heating is hours and hours at a time. And we've now entered, the winter in Ukraine. I mean, the temperatures are now well below zero in many places. So you can see that it's very serious. I mean, the Ukrainian authorities are doing their best to repair stuff, but it's becoming more and more difficult because they're running out of the materials in order to do this.
So what does the West need to do, and particularly the European Union, Amanda, at this point?
I mean, the first thing would be to provide Ukraine with these modern air defenses. I mean, Ukrainians have been shooting down many of the missiles and drones, but it's not enough. They need a much bigger number of modern air defenses, but also the jammers, these electrical systems that block drones. They need those, and they need them as soon as possible. They also require large-scale material and other elements that are necessary for fixing the energy infrastructure, because of the potential that they could become a target as well for Russian strikes. The optimal scenario would be to store these materials, let's say, on the borders of those member states that are nearest. So this would be safe, and it would also allow them to quickly deploy the materials to be used for fixing the infrastructure. And the last thing, but it's also really crucial. I mean, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is now really in dire straits, particularly in areas that are near, front lines or in the territories that have recently been liberated, where you have tens of thousands of people remaining in their homes. So there's a need to supply literally everything to Ukraine, generators, batteries, medical kits, battery suppliers, everything you can think of, food, extra finance. I mean, the list literally goes on and on and on.
Just very briefly, before I bring Janis and Fabian into this, do you think the EU will respond? Are preparations being made to supply some of this equipment that you say is needed to really step into the breach on the humanitarian issue, or is it a little bit slow at the moment? You've muted, Amanda, please. Just to follow up before I bring the others in terms of where the EU is in responding to this humanitarian situation.
Yeah, I mean, the EU has provided a lot of material and support for what they call, winterization and humanitarian assistance. But I mean, unfortunately, I think we're talking about just the tip of the iceberg here. I mean, obviously, it's not just the EU, because you have, other countries and volunteer groups and NGOs, but much more is needed. I mean, for example, fresh water systems, stoves to keep people warm, tents so that multiple people can come and gather in one place to keep warm. I mean, it's an endless list, but we're talking about the lives of millions and millions of Ukrainians. Ukrainians don't want to leave Ukraine. They want to stay there. They want to stand their ground, but they need the necessary humanitarian assistance.
Thank you very much. Janis, from your point of view and perspective, do you think the EU is or will do enough during these incredibly difficult winter months? This is leaving aside military support and so on. And also, Amanda talked there about this switch of tactics because of the battlefield losses. And we saw that really dramatic, remarkable moment with the liberation of Kherson. What impact do you think increasing military success for the Ukrainian forces is likely to have on the debate within the EU, this endless debate that we saw, that ebbs and flows in terms of should you be negotiating, should you be pressing for a ceasefire? Do you think this will increase divisions within the EU about what to do next, or do you think the unity will hold?
Well, first of all, with respect to the first part of your question, Amanda is right. There's more that needs to be done on behalf of the EU 27 with respect to supporting the country in all its different fashions, whether it comes to military support, whether it comes to economic support. The country needs to pay its bill and requires financial assistance. And here also the EU 27 are lagging behind in terms of its decision and disbursement of financial support. Then the humanitarian aspects, which Amanda was already referring to. So the whole scale of support, I think, needs to be further increased. At the same time, we're seeing among the EU 27, also if you follow national debates, an increasing deviation away from the war in Ukraine. We're dealing with some of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, but the attention with respect to what actually is happening on the ground has clearly gone down. And I think that's also having a political effect in terms of not having the same amount of pressure being put on member states' government, thus also on the EU itself, in order to provide even more support, which is obviously needed in the upcoming months, which will be even more difficult than what we've seen in the past. Now, with respect to the degree of unity, I see in general that with that unity is being under pressure. That there is an increasing distrust also among the EU 27, which has to do not only with how the situation develops on the ground, but it has to do with a lot of questions and issues which are either not being addressed, fundamental questions and differences which are there among the EU 27. And as we're witnessing them, and we have been discussing these already in previous EPC updates, you can see that these divisions are becoming more rather than less among the EU 27. This is making it politically difficult to find consensus, and on many of the issues consensus needs to be found, and you have individual countries obstructing, but in general you have increasing divisions among the EU 27. So it's not only Hungary or others to be blamed, as you sometimes simply see in the way in which things are being reported about when it comes to EU unity or disunity. But you see increasing divisions among the EU27, and that's making it more difficult. And if you go back to the first part of the question you raised, especially with respect to the need to provide more assistance rather than even keeping only to the level which we have now reached.
Fabian, your assessment of whether, even if those cracks do deepen, the necessary unity can be maintained, and also to throw into this picture, talk there about the liberation of Kherson and those remarkable Ukrainian advances. But then, of course, there was the moment which everyone had feared, the missile that landed in Poland, killing 2 for a few hours, huge amount of tension, huge amount of concern about what was behind it. Again, how do you think that is playing into the debate in the EU about the response to Russian aggression? Did that, if you like, strengthen the backbone, or did it, do you think, play into the hands of those who are urging negotiation sooner rather than later?
I think what we're seeing now is that we have 2 camps. One side which is arguing that these kind of developments show exactly why we need to do more, why we need to support Ukraine, why we need to be steadfast in our commitment. The other side is saying, well, all of this is creating an unacceptable risk. It is having knock-on effects everywhere else. It is risking the nuclear confrontation. So that's a good reason to stop. I think at the moment, we are still more on the proactive side, but of course it differs also between countries. But paradoxically, success for Ukraine might well mean that that kind of support goes down. It's very different when you have the underdog being attacked, defending itself, than some country which is successful on the battlefield, which is actually showing that it can stand up to the aggression. So I think there's a lot still to be discussed, and I think the question for me is not, will unity hold? I think the question is, will we sacrifice the necessary ambition for unity? Because that's really the worry I would have, is that we ultimately, yes, we maintain the unity between the 27, but at the price of not doing what has to be done. And if that happens, then we will get into a much more difficult situation before this winter is over.
Amanda, your thoughts in terms of what Fabian was just talking about, that the success for Ukraine might mean there is less support or less willingness to support the tensions that were aroused by that missile landing in Poland. How do you see all of that playing? Do you think this is more playing into the hands of those who say, as Fabian put it, this shows we have to stand firm, this shows Ukraine can win this, and if we need to stay behind them? Or do you think it is playing more into the hands of those who say, no, we need to dial this back?
I mean, I think that if there's a break in the unity, it's extremely short-sighted from the side of the EU. If they really want this war to be over and not to have a second war at some point in the future, then this support needs to be maintained and even strengthened. I mean, Ukraine, if I can put it this way, is on a roll at the moment. I mean, they had their amazingly successful liberation of Kherson, which came against their previous success of their counteroffensive in Kharkiv and other areas in that region. So they've managed to liberate more than 50% of the land that Russia was occupying. I mean, Kherson was actually the only regional capital that Russia had taken. And the situation as it stands now means that Ukraine is in a very good position, not just militarily in terms of momentum and tactics, but I mean, the location of Kherson itself is really important in the shape of the next steps of this war, because it comes between Crimea, Dnieper River and the Black Sea. Russia wanted to use Kherson as what I would say was a staging ground to expand further to the banks of the Black Sea, to go to Odessa and Mykolaiv. Now, this is not possible. Ukraine can now control this area, including the waterway, which is the Crimea Canal. This means that Ukraine's in a good position to push further forward and, let's say, perhaps shorten this war if it manages to get the ongoing support from the EU. So it's important that we look at the bigger picture and not the shorter picture, because Ukraine is not going to sit at a negotiating table anytime sooner. So anybody that thinks along those lines is daydreaming.
Thank you very much. And if I could ask our EPC host to make me co-host, or indeed to activate the mics of Dr. Maya Cocken and John Palmer, we'll come to those questions in just a moment. But while we're doing that, just a thought, Fabian, if you would, on China. Because we are seeing China, particularly when it comes to those ratcheting up tensions, talking about the use of nuclear weapons and so on, beginning to take a tougher tone. The Chinese president had very long talks with Joe Biden at the G20, come back to that in a moment. There are those saying this is a sign that Russia really is increasingly isolated. Do you think that is true? Or do you think that may be wishful thinking on the part of the European Union?
I wouldn't say that Russia is isolated. I think that would be a conclusion which goes a bit too far. But I would say that China is considering very carefully what is in its long-term interest. And is it really best for China if it commits wholeheartedly to Russia, especially if Western unity holds? Because that would then create a situation where really China is in a very small group with countries like Russia and some other countries. So I think what we have seen is cautiously positive. We have seen the comments about not using nuclear weapons. I think that was a very important intervention, because that makes it very difficult to see the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which has been threatened. So I think it is cautiously maneuvering, but it's not as far as China now being in the Western camp or not supporting Russia anymore. I think that would be a wrong conclusion.
Janis, was that your reading of it? And then I'll come to those questions in the audience.
I think we need to not be naive here. I think siding with an aggressor who is not winning in his war of aggression is increasingly difficult. And that also means that for Beijing, positioning itself putting itself in a position which is now more criticizing Moscow has largely to do with the fact, which Amanda was alluding towards earlier, that Russia is not being successful on the ground with respect to the war in Ukraine. And that's why Amanda is also right, that if we look into the situation currently, that obviously has to do with the war in Ukraine itself, but also with the multiple consequences beyond the war in Ukraine with respect to international relations and to the global landscape. It is in our total interest to remain united and decisive in our reaction to what Moscow has decided to do on the 24th of February. So I think that's clear. And China is simply positioning itself, taking into account where the situation now is. If the situation would be differently, if the Russians would be gaining ground, would be on the winning side, I think we would see a different reaction coming also from Beijing, but also from others, by the way. So I think it's a clear reaction to the negative developments on the ground, and that's why it's in our interest to continue to support the Ukrainians, not only out of moral reasons and humanitarian reasons, but also out of enlightened self-interest.
I want to come to China, US, and the impact of the US midterm elections in a moment. But Dr. Maya Cocken, if you would like to speak, I have please opened your mic. Dr. Maya Cocken, can you hear me? Let me try John Palmer. John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, John. Over to you.
Good. Very quick question. One of the things that surprised me in the general response to the aggression in Ukraine is how little prominence has been given to any kind of public and active support for the opposition to the war in Russia. Of course, there have been statements which are broadly supportive, but I'm struck by both the reports I've seen and reports I know about, but I haven't directly seen, of the extent in some Russian towns and cities of opposition, including confrontations with the authorities and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a magic fix, but I think it is a pressure valve that's been ignored, perhaps, by the Ukraine's allies. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts on how greater public profile for the opposition in Russia could be given.
I'll come back in a moment, and Amanda, maybe ask you if you can pick up on that, but let me just see if I can before that. Dr. Maya-Kogan, I have, please do unmute yourself if you can. Otherwise, no, there's nothing at the moment. So Amanda, can you pick up on that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, John. I mean, honestly, I think that the opposition to the war in Russia is still quite small, or is very small, and those that do oppose it are putting themselves at risk. I mean, there have been some protests in the street, but I mean, the consequences of this are, you know, ending up in prison or worse. It's very difficult for the West to actually reach out to these actors. I think the bigger problem in Russia is the information space, because the information space is absolutely full of Russian propaganda and disinformation. I mean, I'm looking at the news every day coming out of Russia, or the so-called news, and it's actually horrifying. I mean, messages such as, you know, Ukrainian children should be drowned in rivers and this sort of thing, and very clear messages calling for genocide and more strikes. So I do think there's very limited opportunities to reach out to individuals in Russia. And unfortunately, most of the Russian population actually supports this war. That could be from disinformation or other reasons. But it is very difficult at the moment, I think, to make any progress with the opposition in Russia.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come in, but a quick one if you would.
Very quick. I think it's interesting to see that countries like Russia, but also other countries, have invested very heavily in intervening in our information space. But our ability to actually intervene in other information space, I think, is highly questionable. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're not doing anything, is because we can't.
Just coming back on the question of China and the US, and I mentioned those talks, long talks with Biden that Xi Jinping had at the G20 summit. Some commentators pointing to the fact that he spent 3.5 hours with Biden and 3/4 of an hour with, for example, the French President Emmanuel Macron, and suggesting this is Chinese classic divide and rule. Janis, do you think, what should we read into that, if anything? Does this have implications for you? And let us tie this also, when we're talking about China and US, to the US itself and the midterm elections, and whether you think that is going to impinge the results. Somewhat surprising, Democrats doing much better than expected. How does that play into this mix, do you think?
First of all, I wouldn't read too much into these things. So the argument of saying that the U.S. president, the U.S. is having more attention on China than it has on Europe because of talking less to Macron, I think is very simple, very much simplifying, to put it mildly, what the situation looks like. Obviously, China is of great concern from the U.S. side. It is also an issue of contention when it comes to how strong the reaction and the policy should be vis-a-vis Beijing on the other side of the Atlantic. Although there's an agreement in general among the Democrats and the Republicans, there are differences in terms of how strong one should deal with China, also under the current circumstances. So I think that's the reason why we saw longer discussions with the Chinese leadership than with any European leadership. So I wouldn't interpret too much into this.
And the US midterms?
I think, well, first of all, the result of the midterm was a surprise because even for those who were optimistic. They didn't believe that this would be the result. There was the fear that the Republicans and the Trumpists, so those especially supported by Trump, would clearly have a better result in the midterm election, did prove wrong. So this is a result which I think is much more optimistic, more positive, and more than many had thought. However, if you look at it from a European perspective, what I found telling is how much we were looking across the Atlantic to see what the outcome of the midterm elections were, because we were fearful that if the outcome which some were expecting would have been the outcome, i.e. that Trump would have done well, that the Republicans would have done much better than they have done, that would have potentially very strong negative repercussion on us, which just shows what the degree of impotence which we have, because it shows how much we are depending on the US. And I must say that if I compare the situation today to 8 months ago or 9 months ago, to the start of the war in Ukraine, we have become more dependent on the US, and thus we're even more dependent on what the outcomes of the elections are in the US. That is very much telling of what to expect in 24, and how much we will be increasingly under pressure in case things develop in a different direction in the US in future.
Indeed.
So there's a lot of homework we need to do.
And it is indeed striking the degree to which everyone follows precisely what's happening, every twist and turn in the US, even of some of those individual counts. And yet if you said to them, what do you make of the result of the Swedish elections or another country within the club, they would know little or even less. Fabian, a comment to that. And then Amanda, to this question, I'd like to ask you about how you think the midterms will or will not influence the US's attitude towards support for Ukraine. But on that broader question first, Fabian, and then I'll come to Amanda before we let her go.
I mean, just picking up on your comment, I think, yes, we follow every twist and turn, but that's because it matters, because it still is certainly our security guarantor, and what we are seeing now in Ukraine could never have happened if the US hadn't done what it did. But it also matters very much economically. And it matters because it also determines where Europe stands geopolitically. How do we react to China will, to a large extent, also depend on what comes from Washington. And I think what we shouldn't forget is, yes, the midterms were better than many people expected, but the longer term question is still there. What happens in a very fragmented political society like the US has become if we now get a Trumpian or a very much make America great, America first president again, who doesn't have the kind of commitment to Europe, the kind of commitment to our security, our prosperity than we have seen before. And we have yet to come up with an answer.
Thank you. Amanda, on this question of whether you think it will have any significant, I mean, there was a huge concern that if the Republicans took control of the Senate and the House, that we would see US support for Ukraine drop off dramatically. Do you now think that threat, and the House is going to have a Republican majority, but not a very big one, what is your sense of where this leaves the US in terms of its response and its support for Ukraine?
I mean, well, if that had happened, Ukraine would have been screwed, quite honestly. So it's great that it didn't. I mean, I expect a continuation of the support that we've seen so far from the Biden administration. I mean, Joe Biden has always been a good friend of Ukraine. He's been a friend for many years, and he's really, done the right thing. He's already passed a new large-scale military package, which should be arriving shortly in Ukraine since the midterms. So this in itself sends a very strong message that they're there for the long haul. But I do think that the US would like to see the Europeans channel more funds, not only into defense, but also to non-lethal aid. Because if you look at what's been provided so far in terms of, arms, reconstruction, humanitarian aid, I mean, the US has provided twice as much as the EU across the board. This isn't fair. I mean, the EU needs to do more, and they should certainly be taking the lead when it comes to the reconstruction of Ukraine. The US can't pay for everything forever, if I can put it that way.
Absolutely. Amanda, thank you so much. It's always great to have you with us on Update, sharing your expertise and knowledge of that region of the world. Come back again soon, please.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you. Let us move on, gentlemen, now to a bit of a whistle-stop tour around a number of issues. And I want to start with COP27, marathon talks over the weekend. There was an upside and there was a downside. An upside in terms of wealthy nations recognizing their responsibility for the emissions they caused. A downside, nobody taking responsibility for going further and faster on emissions. Overall, Fabian, what is your reading of the outcome of COP27? I mean, they were hailing the deal on support for vulnerable countries, the Loss and Damage Fund, as historic. But maybe they were also doing that because they were trying to cover up the fact that really on the other side, deeply disappointing, indeed even threats that the EU delegation might walk out over the weekend. What's your overall reading of where we are now?
I fully understand why you have to try to come up with something positive to say. But ultimately, this is extremely thin, and it is very disappointing that we didn't have more progress on an issue where clearly time is against us. The longer we delay the necessary actions, the more difficult it will get. So this is, yes, it is a step forward, but it is a very small step forward. And if you even look at von der Leyen's statement after COP27, it is full of terminology like a small step. We've treated some of the symptoms, but not cured the patient from its fever, i.e. we have not addressed the real issue. And this, I think, is very disappointing. It's not unexpected, but it's very disappointing. We haven't really made progress. And I think in reality, even though this was not part of the conclusions, but in reality, the 1.5 degrees is dead.
Janis, would you share that assessment, and also in terms of the potential knock-on impact of that failure in Sharm el-Sheikh, in terms of some of the concrete measures needed to implement the Green Deal? Will it have a knock-on effect, do you think?
I would be even more negative than Fabian was. I think this was less than a thin deal. Yes, it was not a total failure. And there was pressure in the final days of COP27 to make sure that at least there will be an outcome which can be then presented to the wider public as another step in the right direction. But if you look into the details, there are no details. There will be another discussion at the next summit in the United Arab Emirates. There is no concrete sum which is being mentioned. You already hear, for example, as we were talking about the US previously, of how leading Republicans are reacting to the outcome. When we move forward to the next summit, I think we will find ourselves with the same problems ahead of us. So we actually have made a millimeter, but at the same time, I think we're moving in the wrong direction, because there is, on the one hand, this acceptance that we won't be able to reach the 1.5 deal. So we are looking at how can we deal with the symptoms of what is happening. I'm not saying that this is wrong, but in terms of our efforts to try to counter as much as possible the potential effects of climate change, I think we're not moving in the right direction. We clearly see that there are different groupings. We also see that the consequences of the war in Ukraine, by the way, which has hampered the relationship between the US and China, is also affecting global climate talks. It's also affecting how countries like Saudi Arabia are positioning themselves, and you could continue. So I rather think we're moving in the wrong direction rather than taking up speed to move in the right direction.
And do you think it has any impact in terms of the discussions on the concrete elements designed to implement the Green Deal, or not?
Well, I think it's going to be pushing us, because it's going to say, okay, there's no alternative, because at the global level, we're not able to reach consensus. So at least at the European level, and you will see that European publics will especially once we move into a situation where we have learned to deal with the consequences of the war in Ukraine when it comes to energy. Once we've got there, there will be increasing pressure, public pressure on politicians in the EU27 to deliver when it comes on to the Green Deal. But at the same time, we will know that even if we speed up our activities at the global level, we're moving in the wrong direction.
And indeed, and Fabian, they could also raise the competitiveness question again. If the rest of the world is not willing to do it, then why should we, particularly at a time like this? Are you concerned about knock-on effects on the domestic agenda?
Of course, and it will inevitably have that knock-on effect, not least because we are seeing that some parties on the populist, on the right, are positioning themselves also increasingly as climate skeptic, arguing that in a situation where we have a very painful cost of living crisis, we should not worry too much about doing the right thing on climate change. It's a long-term issue. It cannot be addressed on the global level anyway. So the argument is, let's not overdo it. But clearly, all of that doesn't address the underlying existential threat which we're facing.
Indeed not. And on that point, and that brings me, Janis, neatly to the discussion on the gas price cap. And it's seemingly, I mean, the divisions don't seem to be getting in any way lessened. We do have another commission paper, but they call it just a basis for further discussion. There is a meeting of energy ministers at the end of this week, but are we likely to get anywhere? Are you seeing any progress? And if not, what will the consequences be?
No, I think that we're actually not seeing a lot of progress. I remember when we were discussing the issue in October, where there were some who were saying that potentially we might now get to a deal. There is the parts and the elements of a potential compromise are out there, but the pressure to get to an agreement among the EU27 is again not as high as it needs to be in order to get to an agreement, because the differences among the 27 are huge. And it's not, by the way, only to say that there's one camp versus the other. There are multiple camps. There are the camps of those who believe in the need for a gas price cap. There are those who are the free marketees, but then there are many in between, and also in terms of how to reach one or the other. In terms of the bigger goals which are being set, there are huge differences with respect to what model to apply. So in order to find a compromise, and I still believe that a compromise is possible, and maybe we will probably have it back on the agenda at the December European Council, and potentially then the pressure will be higher as we will be in the deep of the winter, that we will then potentially reach a deal. But now we're still far away from there, and the pressure is not there to reach an agreement at this present point in time. And the consequences of that is, again, showing us that on some issues where there are dividing positions among member states, if the pressure is not strong enough, we're not able to deliver. So this is another issue where we are leaving it up to member states to find ways of dealing with the situation individually, while we're not able to find collective ways of dealing with the situation. And as long as there's not the necessary pressure there in order to find a compromise, we will not be moving enough. And this is not something which energy ministers can solve by themselves.
Indeed not. Fabian, a word to those potential consequences, but also more broadly in terms of the EU's response to the economic crisis and the prospect of deepening recession. What more can and should be done, and what sort of investments? I know you've written, I'm not sure if it's been published yet, but if not, it was imminent, a paper on the question of investments and where the focus should be. What should the EU be doing that it isn't now?
I think firstly, I would refer back to an older paper as well. I think one of the things we really have to address is the inequality and the direct impact that is going to have on political feasibility of the union. In particular, if we are in a cost of living crisis, in an energy, a food crisis, if some parts of Europe end up being cold and hungry while others are not, then this will have massive political implications. So we need to find ways of showing solidarity at the European level. But beyond that, we also have to deal with an incredibly difficult economic situation. essentially the kind of mechanisms we had in the past cannot work in the current environment because we have such high inflation. So I think what we should be focusing on, and that's what the new paper, which has just been published, is focusing on, is to make investments for the long term, to make investments with an intergenerational mindset, where we are looking at what will help the next generations. How can we make sure that we get on the right course for the longer term? And there, I think investment in technology, investment in education are crucial components. They're not the only things we should be doing, but certainly those are areas where we need to become much more serious. And in particular, at the European level, we do have some possibilities for investing in technology. We had the European Sovereign Fund, which von der Leyen mentioned in her State of the Union. If that would be some form of equity buildup in technology firms, in new technologies, in also the technologies which can address our societal challenges like climate change, like the aging society, then that would be a positive step forward at this moment in time. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I had to mute myself momentarily. Right, sorry, my computer's misbehaving. Need to move on because we have a couple of other issues to do on a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Hungary, first of all, I'd like to come to, and the rule of law, because there is a great deal of expectation, anticipation that the European Commission will recommend at the end of this month the release of billions of euros of funding for Hungary, despite continuing concerns about the rule of law. This has caused reportedly some divisions and arguments within the Commission and certainly some member states and indeed in the European Parliament. What is your thinking on this question, Janis, in terms of what the Commission should or should not do? And playing devil's advocate, some people say, well, the Commission hasn't really got any choice here. Because Hungary is holding the EU to ransom over a number of issues, including, going back to our first topic today, support for Ukraine, 18 billion euros worth of support for Ukraine, including sanctions on Russia. And therefore, at a time like this, this is an argument that the EU can't win and therefore has to give in. What is your sense of where we are and what the EU should do and what's politically doable, as it were?
Well, first of all, there's always room for maneuver, but it's correct that crunch time is coming up, is approaching. The Commission will probably have to come up with a decision on the 30th of November. This is also what is now the envisaged date for a decision on behalf of the Commission, because if they don't do that, then the whole timeline will not work out in December. We have a meeting of finance ministers on the 6th of December. So there is now the moment of truth when it comes to this issue approaching. But my expectation is, and that's not what I would advocate, but I think that's what my expectation looks like, is that we will that this will lead to another compromise, that the Commission will propose to withhold some of the EU funds, i.e. not to pay out the full sums to Hungary, but rather to argue that yes, Hungary has moved, that the government in Hungary, I should have said, has moved on certain issues, but there's more that needs to be done, thus also reflecting the pressure coming from the European Parliament, where the argument is that only a handful of things have been done out of the things that need to be done with respect to especially judicial reform, so that the European Parliament will at least get something, and also some of the more critical member states, and as you mentioned, within the Commission itself, there are a good number of commissioners who are much more critical than the current leadership, and von der Leyen will have to please all sides, also because she's having in mind what happens in 24 in terms of her trying to stay in power. So I think that there will be a compromise where some of the sums will be withheld until Hungary delivers, or the current government in Hungary delivers more with respect to reforms as the ones which are being called for, especially in Brussels and Strasbourg.
And Fabian, is that compromise the right thing to do? Is it the inevitable thing to do in the circumstances, or should the EU be being much tougher?
I think it's very difficult to argue it's the right thing to do, but it is the inevitable thing. But I think what we should be having a discussion about is how can we actually prevent this from happening in future? And there was a discussion where a lot of people were saying, well, we can't do anything else because Hungary has a veto and it can hold up the process in so many important areas, including particularly importantly when it comes to actions to support Ukraine. But then for me, the obvious answer is then we have to do something to remove that veto rather than being guided by it, rather than being blackmailed, because ultimately that's what it comes down to. And I think this is something which Janis and I have also written about. Is there are ways we could try to find more qualified majority voting, finding unanimity -1 kind of rules at the European level, or doing things in parallel to the EU system if we cannot get agreement for that. But it cannot be that we have just simply moved on from that reform agenda for our decision-making processes, because yet again, what Hungary is doing shows that we can be blackmailed when it comes to these questions.
And this links, of course, Janis, to your favorite topic, the Conference on the Future of Europe, and whether it is ignored or whether it is those issues are picked up. Your feeling about what will happen if the compromise is too great, as Fabian was saying, inevitable probably, but if they go too far and give too much.
That would be the worst of an outcome, because yes, we will probably see that there will be an attempt to find a compromise, as I was trying to describe it earlier. But as Fabian was saying, if you look into the potential long-term compromises of consequences of going for a compromise would be too easy on Orban, on the leadership in Budapest, would send exactly the wrong signal. And let's not forget, we're having a prime minister of Hungary who now is extremely isolated. He's much more isolated than he was 6 months ago or a year ago. Also among those who were still on his side and protecting him or giving him support, that support has reduced, given also how he has positioned himself in the Ukraine question. So we have a very isolated prime minister government, which is a lot under pressure at home, because that's part of the internal political deal, i.e. of being able to secure EU funding in the country itself. And I think we need to play out the fact that he is now isolated, and we need to increase the pressure in political terms, while at the same time, yes, we need to be also realistic of how far we can go and what the consequences of that is. And we're seeing that Orban is playing that game very well, politically, also at the European level. And sometimes we, on the other side, are not playing it politically very well, also because we need to coordinate, obviously, among a good number of actors, including member states governments, but also EU institutions. But it is, the further you get in these kind of confrontation, the more it becomes a political confrontation, which means that we need to be politically wise in how we operate and take into account also how that is playing out internally with Hungary itself.
Okay, I wanted to move on now to Fabian and my least favorite topic, the question of EU-UK relations, and really 3 elements to this question. Let's start with the Northern Ireland Protocol. There is talk that a solution is close. Maroš Šefčovič said earlier this month, we are not worlds apart. There are moments when it sounds as if they're very, very close to resolving it, and then other moments where it seems to be receding. Fabian, you have a very good inside track on all of that. What is your reading of where we are on that specific issue?
Well, I think a lot of this is unfortunately very familiar to people who've been watching EU-UK relations for a while. Yes, there's a better mood music, but in the end, what counts is what we see on the ground, whether there is actual progress or not. And so far, it hasn't materialized into something. And that is also because any kind of compromise would be controversial within the UK, certainly within Northern Ireland. The DUP in particular would never accept any form of compromise. because any compromise still has the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol at its heart. So for the moment, yes, it's better mood music, but we need to see that actually leading to not only having an agreement on the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also the complete withdrawal of the Northern Ireland Protocol bill, which we shouldn't forget is always hanging in the background, threatening to not implement the Northern Ireland Protocol and effectively to break international law to do so.
And there were a number of reports over the weekend, and Janis, perhaps I could come to you on this, that the UK government might be on the verge of seeking a Swiss-style relationship with the EU. This was floated in one of the leading newspapers. It was immediately shot down by the government, but suggestions that maybe they were trying to test the waters. And my question to you really is not about the UK side of that, but the EU side of it. First of all, what would it actually mean? What do we mean when we talk about a Swiss-style relationship? And secondly, is this something, I mean, my sense has always been the EU really doesn't like the relationship it has with Switzerland. It's too complicated, it's messy, and so on. And therefore, the EU wouldn't be jumping up and down and saying to the UK, if that's what you want, yes, have it. What is your sense of the EU side of this? Because the UK always conducts this debate as if there isn't another side in it. So how do you think the EU would respond if, contrary to the denials, that is what the government is looking at?
Well, clearly there's another side on this debate, which is the EU27 and the EU institutions. If you look into EU-Swiss relations, this is a complex relationship, which is not in the best of conditions now for a long time. So if you take that as a role model, this is not an easy role model. Plus, if it is to work, and it requires a lot of trust between the two sides involved. And in giving the history, the longer history, but also the more recent history of the relationship with the UK, trust is something which is very, very, very rare on the side of the EU27 when it comes to London. So looking for a solution which is very complicated, which in order to work needs both sides to be on the same page. And we, as you were referring to, have seen how the reactions were also in the UK. And that obviously is also being witnessed from the EU's perspective. That's not the wrong way to go then from an EU perspective, because if you don't trust the other side, you will look for something which potentially will work, given the experience which we've had over the past year or years. So I don't see that this is a solution, but that doesn't then mean that what we're now having is the best of worlds. So how to deal with that? I always like to leave it back to the two of you to find solutions rather than me.
I know you do, but I just, on that note, and Fabian, do react on the question of a Swiss-style agreement, but just more broadly, and to answer those who point to the opinion polls in the UK, quite staggering numbers now. 56% of people this weekend said that Brexit had been the wrong decision. 23%, less than 1 in 4, said it had been the right decision. And in those circumstances, there are people who predict, well, let's have another referendum and let's rejoin. And the pressure will become intolerable if the opinion polls continue in this direction. First of all, from a British perspective, do you see any chance of that happening? And from an EU perspective, do you think the reaction would be brilliant, marvelous, we can't wait to have you back? Or, oh God, please no?
Well, firstly, just on the Swiss deal, I think for those familiar with the Brexit terminology, it's about unicorns eating non-existent cake. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because the EU doesn't want it, but it's also not going to happen because the UK doesn't want it, because any kind of deal which would get the UK closer to the single market means alignment with EU law, and Sunak just again has ruled that out completely. So this is not something which is really on the table. But then rejoining, I think, is even further away. So I don't think
those opinion polls are staggering.
They are staggering, and in some ways, they are confirming what many of us have said for quite a long time,
Exactly.
that it is a very bad idea because it will have costs. And now people are seeing and feeling the costs. So clearly they're coming to the conclusion that it was a bad idea all along. But it doesn't follow that you can simply go back to the way things were. Because the UK would have to make a new application, it would have to go through a process. There is the trust issue, which Janis has mentioned from an EU side. Would we really believe that this is a firm commitment which is there for the long term? How do we deal with the issue which we've seen over and over again during the Brexit negotiations and the process afterwards about not having a written constitution? So things are very variable, very much in flux. A new government coming in can change everything overnight. These are all things which would worry the EU, but also from a UK perspective. Coming back in would mean accepting, for example, the commitment to the euro. It would have to accept that there's no budget rebate. It would have to accept that there are no exceptions, that there's no way of renegotiating the kind of opt-outs, the kind of special deals which it has had before. So I see this as at the most optimistic about something you can talk about in a decade. But in the short term, it's about more alignment, but then the UK has to accept that alignment comes as a cost. And that is the effect of Brexit, is you turn yourself from a rule maker to a rule taker.
Indeed, and they're not there yet. A question which links to what I wanted to ask you by way of closing from Inda Bulgarin, who says, it seems that COVID, and it's true, updates started because of COVID to keep people abreast of what was happening. And Inda says, it seems COVID has disappeared from the agenda. If so, what are the challenges that lie ahead for the EU this winter? And what will be the consequences if they are not addressed correctly? Comes back to this question of unity in 2023. I was going to ask a shorter time horizon, but I'll throw it forward as Inda does. In terms of the key challenge for you, each of you, that we need to face and address between now and the end of this year, and the key challenge if we're to maintain unity through into 2023. Janis first, and then Fabian can have the last word. Janis.
I think the key challenge is that, and this was something which Fabian already mentioned, is the level of ambition. This is closely linked to the question of unity. And up to the present point, and I see that this is getting worse rather than improving, we are sacrificing the level of ambition in order to be able to show at least some unity on the more day-to-day issues. And even there we struggle. If you look into some of the issues we were discussing today, whether it has to do with Hungary, whether it has to do with support, financial support also to Ukraine, on all these day-to-day issues, energy crisis, how to deal with gas prices, on all of these issues, we're not able to find compromises. And we're also not being able to find these compromises because we differ on so many issues and also many fundamental issues. And I fear that as we're moving into 23, even if the situation on the ground in Ukraine somewhat improves, the fundamental issues which divide us now will still remain with us, and the longer term consequences of the Zeitenwende, of the watershed moment we experienced on the 24th of February. So unfortunately, as long as we are not dealing heads on with most of our differences, putting them on the table, having a strategic debate, and we are not having all of that, the more likely it becomes that we will be disunited. And I think that will be a huge challenge for the EU 27 and for the individual member states and for our overall ambition level, which is already low and will be even less lower.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
I think the biggest challenge politically we're facing is the cost of living, because it's something which people are experiencing very directly. But of course, all of these are interrelated. I mean, as we have put it, this is a permacrisis which has now been aggravated by the watershed moment. So, of course, COVID continues to be there, continues to have an impact. It also has an impact internationally. So we cannot deal with these issues in isolation. We actually have to look at how do they interact, what can we do? And for me, the biggest paradox we're facing at the moment is that when we're looking at the crisis we've gone through, and in particular the recent month, I think it should be obvious that there are more things we have to do together at the European level. But the big paradox is that politically, that recognition isn't there. It isn't being translated into reality. So we might be in a situation where, despite knowing that there is a better way of dealing with these challenges, we're still not doing it. And if that happens, we will all be poorer for it, but we will also be less safe for it from natural catastrophes like pandemics, but also from security threats like Russia.
Thank you very much. And I do urge you, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't already read some of the publications that Janis and Fabian and some members of the EPC team have put together on this question of ambition and unity, please do take a look. And on that mention, there will be Fabian's commentary on the investment strategy, the European Sovereignty Fund, to look out for. Next, during the course of this week, we have a number of events relating to the issues we've been talking about. On Wednesday, COP27, a much more detailed analysis of the outcome of that and next steps. On Thursday, Sweden's priorities for the presidency of the Council with the Swedish permanent representative. And also on Thursday, Beyond the Crisis, Reforming EU Economic Governance for the Coming Decade, that with Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni. And finally, just to mention, December the 1st, I will have the privilege of moderating, and I'm really looking forward to it, the EPC's Jubilee Conference, which has the title, The EU's Reckoning with Power, an intriguing title. Do hope many of you will be able to join us for that. And Janis, Fabian and I will be back with another update after the next summit in December. So thank you very much, Fabian, Janis, Amanda in absentia. Thank you to you as well. But most of all, thank you to all of you for joining, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.